Good evening, and welcome to Black Exposure. Our discussion this evening will center around gang violence, and we are most fortunate this evening to have as our guest Dr. Ernest Smith, who has done a study on graffiti, the makings of gangs, and gang violence. Sharing the interviewing duties with me this evening is my good friend Bill Houston. And Dr. Smith, welcome to Black Exposure. Why don't you initially just tell us a little bit about you and then go into your subject of graffiti.
Well, I'm an associate professor of pediatrics and pediatric cardiology at the King Drew Medical Center. And I'm in charge of the community division of pediatrics at Charles R. Drew Medical School. And one of our charges was looking at the health of children.
One moment, you are from the Lehigh Valley. We got to get that.
I'm originally from Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, graduate of Liberty High School class in 1949.
Okay.
And also I studied music at the Conservatory of Music here.
Very good.
Right.
Okay.
But our big point was when we first opened the hospital in Watts, we were looking at what kills the children. And in the adolescent population, we were beginning to see the signs that the leading cause of death was homicide. Now, this was in 1971 and 72. So one of the things we did then was to look at how to create a program that would begin to approach violence, gangs, and et cetera. Well, before we jumped in, we had to study. As we began to study, we began to notice that there were some things that were not right. Number one, the gangs were not being organized by young people, and they were not even being organized by black people. And the parents of a lot of the boys that were being pulled into the gangs were very perplexed, because they began to notice guns and all kinds of implements that their children had, and they knew they couldn't afford them. So they began to raise questions as to where the kids were getting their guns, who was organizing them into gangs, and just what was going on. Well, when we began to look into that, then we began to identify what we thought would be some people or groups that might be involved with organizing these young African-American kids, and that they weren't thugs. In other words, it was not the mafia, and it was not the Klan or anything like that. It might have actually been within the government. But we
That's an interesting theory. Actually, the government doing it?
Within the government.
Within the government.
Within the government. Now, we couldn't prove that naturally, and we also knew that to go and begin to deal with that would be very dangerous. Now, once we begin to say that adolescents were not really involved in organizing that warfare and organizing the gangs, and it was not an adolescent phenomenon, and we began to try to teach that and deal with that, we began to run into problems. And as we ran into problems, it became obvious to us that if we pushed too far, we would end up dead.
Dr. Smith, what problems?
Well, police problems. Let's say it straight out. In other words, the people that gave us the biggest contention were the police. Now, you have to go back
to the
LAPD, etc. You have to go back to the period of the 1970s, 71, and also the locale, which was Watts, California. And remember, they were just 6 years out of the riot, which was one of the worst riots in the United States. Mm-hmm. So that means then that community was very well under surveillance. And there were all kinds of things that had been going on that most people didn't know anything about. And it wasn't until the Frank Church Senate Investigation Committee report came out in about 74 that people began to understand that, yes, the government was very much involved with things that were going on in the black community there as well as other places. Well, because we didn't want to subject any of the students, medical students or residents, to any harm, then what we did was we made a dictum that we would not work with gangs. But what we would do, we would be a consultant to anyone who did work with gangs, and we would also work with the people who worked with gangs. Now, as we began to look at that, we said, now, what we think we can't prove. But if we could find another medium that we could use as a control, and show that actually a lot of this was not done by young people, then if we could show that young people were not really instrumental in writing the graffiti, then perhaps people would believe then they were not instrumental in organizing gangs. Well, we were shocked because once we got into the graffiti, we saw no tracks of adolescents. One of the first things that let us know something was wrong was we didn't find any misspellings on the wall. Everything was written very well. Another thing we didn't find was a lot of cursing. And especially for the adolescent population, they just enjoy the opportunity to write those kinds of things on the wall. Mm-hmm. The other thing we did not see was John Loves Mary and any of the traditional adolescent writings. As we began to investigate more and more and more, we had to go to the library. And the more we went to the library, the more we uncovered, and the more we dealt with Celtic history and Druidism, the more enlightenment we got. Now, it was interesting because we started this project in about 1974 and literally stopped around 1983. And every conclusion that we drew by 1983. And one of the things that we felt was that there were some things being done in terms of organization within the nation, and that the young people, the adolescent population, were being used to effect that. And one of the things I think that anyone who deals with psychology would understand, if you ever wanted to subvert a population, the best group to go through would be the adolescent population, because they're the most vulnerable of any population. So as we began to look into our graffiti, then we saw there was a very heavy plan, and a very heavy plan that really didn't come through to us until we came back to Bethlehem. Now, I have four slides I want to show you on the monitor. And the first one is just an idea of how we approach the problem. That's Che Guevara, and that's on the San Bernardino Freeway in Los Angeles, and there is no roadway, a side road alongside of that wall. In other words, you're right on the highway when you drive. So you can't climb on anything and put that up on that height. If you lean over the wall, you can't really execute that kind of stenciling without being seen. The only way you could put that up there is through a cherry picker. So in other words, whoever changes the lamps on the freeway also put the stencil up. That is our feeling. Now, in other words, when we began to look at saying, let's question and question, then we began to notice that we saw writings of the Ku Klux Klan, of the Nazi Party, of punk rock, of the witchcraft, et cetera, and it got us deeper and deeper. Numerology, you name it, all of that was on the wall. Now, as we began to say then that there are a lot of people who were really putting messages out, then we began to take each one of those messages at face value. So we thought that the punk rockers had their program, the Klan had a number of its programs, the Nazi Party had its programs, et cetera, et cetera. Now, it isn't until we came to Bethlehem, back to Liberty High School, that we began to get a clue that something else was happening. So if we can get the other slides, please.
You started in L.A.
Started in L.A. There you
Bethlehem.
look. There you got it. That's Liberty High School, 1979. Can you get the next slide? We happened to be just walking through, having come from a conference in New York, and we looked at one of the inscriptions on the wall that speaks to the Gettysburg Address, that government of the people, by the people, for the people shall not perish from the earth. And if you look at that, shall not perish, you'll see that the knot has been chiseled out, and there's some green paint on the inside of it. Underneath that inscription is a green cross which is painted in, which is generally a sign of the Klan. Can I get the last slide? And if you look along the side of that same building, you'll see KKK scratched into the granite. Now, that looks like the KKK put that up there. But as we went back to Los Angeles and began to analyze that, we said, now, you know, we looked at most of the programs that the KKK allegedly has, such as the Doomsday Program and a couple other of their programs. But I don't ever remember that the Ku Klux Klan was advocating the overthrow of the government of the United States. And that's what that change does. That change says that this government shall perish. Now, to my knowledge, the Klan was anti-black, anti-Jew, just about everything, but not anti-government. So then we raised the question, did the Klan put that on the wall? Then, of course, corollary, if they didn't, who did? Well, that's how we started. We started, did the African-American kids write graffiti in Watts? And if they didn't, who did? And then in the interim, we came through all of these other groups, Klan, Nazi Party, Black Sabbath and all this witchcraftery. But then when we get to the end point, which is Liberty High School, then we have to question the whole thing. So what it means then, we concluded, was that somebody is busy doing a lot of things in the name of a lot of groups. So that there are a lot of things that might be happening within the Klan that they are not aware of, within the Nazi Party that they are not aware of, just as there are things that are happening within African-American gang groups that they are not aware of. Then the question is, who is in charge? So our feeling then was that there exists some group that is masterminding all of this. For what purpose? Number one, we said, and we said this as early as 1981, that if you divided this nation into its component parts, black, white, brown, gay, female, whatever, give each one of them a reason to hate the other. Then all you have to do is wait for the day that you blow the whistle and the whole country will go after each other. In other words, you could institute a race war or any kind of war in the country and destroy this nation. because you have then manipulated the nation to that point that everyone is suspicious and everyone is coming at each other's throats. Now, we say that in '81, and if you read your news media today, and if you look at what you're seeing on television today, that's where we are. Now, all of this was done in the name of gangs, but most particularly in the name of African American and Puerto Rican and Hispanic Mexican type gangs. So this is what the message then, as far as we're concerned, is of the graffiti. So when we deal with the violence in Los Angeles, and we dealt with the gangs in Los Angeles, we did not deal with single parenting, and we did not deal with the general causes, lack of morality, and this kind of thing that people are putting out today as a means of stemming the violence. Our point being that this is a contrived, organized event. And when I came to Bethlehem, I also learned that you have a problem coming. And one of the problems that you might have coming, they say, is that you've got graffiti now that speaks to gangs from Chicago.
There was an article in the newspaper about it.
Right.
Indicating that there were some instances where there might be some gang activity.
Mm-hmm.
Now,
and that was based on what?
Based on some graffiti that they found on some buildings on the south side of our city.
Mm-hmm. That's very interesting. I came through Bethlehem again in 1992, and I did some more shots on graffiti. I saw nothing in the city that would bring me to believe that there was anybody outside of the city here to organize anything. I saw a lot of punk rock, a lot of witchcraft under the Fahy Bridge. I saw some very old graffiti that would speak to the Klan, but I didn't see anything that was new and fresh that would speak to anything, newly being organized in the city. One of the things that we decided that there was a format that generally was followed. Number one, that generally there was graffiti that came up, then propaganda came up about the graffiti, then generally depending on the neighborhood and whether it was a believable neighborhood, then there ended up with some murder. And then that scared everybody, and then you could put out more propaganda, and then the gangs came. And then what happened was that you'd panic the children, particularly the young people, and then the guns would flow, and then you got your gang thing ready to go. But the gangs do not come first, the graffiti comes first. The gangs are about the last to show.
So you're saying they're really related then, the graffiti and the gangs and the whole ball of wax?
The whole ball of wax is related, although the gangs and the graffiti may not be related. In other words, the children will write what they're told to write or taught to write, but they don't write first. Somebody writes first, even before they're organized. And as you move along that path, you'll finally get to the organization of the children.
We might go back to, you say that there's a grand conspiracy. What is this grand conspiracy? To set this nation at each other's throats, the ethnic groups and et cetera. You see this as a grand conspiracy? Well, who's behind it?
Well, I can't tell you who's behind it, but I could allude. Number one, if you ask what is the greatest, what's the biggest thing on the agenda for not only the United States, but for the world in this day and time, it's that concept of the one world. And I think that was put out when Mr. Bush was president. Well, there's no way in the world you can have a one world anything as long as the United States remains strong. And the strength of the United States is not in its government, but in its people. Its people are its government. Now, if you're going to create any kind of one world event in this world, you're going to have to take this country down. If you're going to take this country down, you don't do it by just changing presidents or changing senators, you change people. So any program that would have to come to the United States would have to weaken the people. Now that we saw in the numerology of the graffiti, which talked about 29 cycles, and listed 1980 to 1998, which if you subtract, you'll get 18 divided in half, you'll get to 9. Well, 1980 is the year that Ronald Reagan ran in, and by 1989 he was out. But we saw a lot of changes that occurred in that first 9 cycle. In other words, the industry of the country, the economics of the country, a lot of changes. So the question is that if you say, well, can this country be changed? Well, it is in the process of being changed. And most of the people don't understand even what the change is all about. Half of the reason that they're able to be molded to go after each other is based on the economy. And the fact that they don't have the economic strength, home to home.
Well, we're moving from an industrial economy to a service economy.
Who are you servicing?
Servicing, hopefully, the people in the United States and the people in the rest of the world.
Well, how can you service people here that have no jobs?
Well, even though you don't have a job, you still have to have services. You still have to be able to buy some food. If you do,
Well,
you still have to be able to do many of those things. Even if you don't have a job, then of course you're getting money from the government based on unemployment and et cetera.
Well, you see, that's the trick to me. Somebody's got to dig in the ground to start the thing. Somebody's got to have something to sell, and out of that it begins to come to the point that you can have the luxury of having a service. But you can't start off having a service when you got nothing else.
Well,
So what I'm getting to being that if you're going to be a service economy that is bigger than this country that you have to service because there's nothing here to service. So my point would be you're back to the one world.
well, I don't know whether we get to the point where there's nothing to service.
Well, what are you servicing?
Okay, you're servicing the people. You become a service economy because you no longer have factories and et cetera. There's many factories. Everyone is not working in a factory. People are doing service type jobs, whether or not they are doing something at a higher economic level or a lower economic level.
Well, you have to take my point. So you do a service level, and here's where you are at this level, but you cannot hang up there in the air. There has to be something that is solidly on the ground that supports it. Now, if you remove the things that are solidly on the ground that support it in this country, then those things must exist somewhere. Then they don't exist here.
Doctor, if this theory is true, this means that in 1970, 1972, someone had some long-range plans for this country. Could you tell us what should or what can we do about it to bring this to a halt or remedy this situation?
I think the very first thing that needs to happen, and that is dealing with the violence and really getting the violence in order, but also getting the young people who will be used for the violence in order. This can only happen if the young people are taught properly and understand really what's going on around them. Many of them are involved in what I would call an adolescent panic, that once they hear that this is what we're doing, then that's what they do. Now, it doesn't mean they want to do it or they feel that they enjoy doing it, but it's the point that this is what we do. This is kind of that peer grouping that is a part of the adolescent phenomenon where they have to kind of get their information from each other as well as from the parents, but the parents have less input than their peer groups would have at this time. So if you can control the peer group, you can control the child. Now, if you understand that, then that means then that you have to really put a big circle around the adolescent population and watch out what inroads are coming into the peer group as to what is being taught to the peer group so that you can make sure that that whole population is not being manipulated and used. So dealing with the young of this country, the adolescent population of this country and the preteens is very essential. But you can't deal with them by saying that their problem is caused by single parents, laziness, all kinds of moral decay in the home, breakup of the family. All these things do is to tell the child that he is worthless. And it takes away the self-esteem. So that if you're trying to say, now I want to turn your mind to life and living and moving into higher levels, and that there are things in life that you need to do and can accomplish, I can't start talking about your mother and your home and everything around you that's being a scrounge and then expect anything good to come of you.
But I've seen, I've not done a study like you have, but I've seen articles, I've seen interviews of young people. And the one thing they ask these young gang members, why do you belong to the gang? The answer always is, it's family. I'm wanted here. I'm part of it. Now surely, if they had a strong family ties of their own, there would not be this need, this excessive need. Now I think kids, even when we might have been growing up, you had a gang. But the gang wasn't like the gangs are, the violence and etc. People who sort of hung out together on a corner or at the ball field or something else like that.
Let's say this way, they were the worst kids in town.
Not necessarily.
Yes, by the standards of the day, because the good kids didn't hang out on the corner or do the things that they claim those bad gang kids did. The only thing is we didn't shoot anybody because we didn't have any guns. In other words, you see, you have to carry everything in its own generation.
I understand that.
But what we do see is a similarity between our group at our age and this group is that we had the need to be together.
Okay, but and they say that, but I don't see the leap. What theory you're telling us this evening is graffiti
Let me
is
go
the
back
signal.
to your point. Let me go back to your point of what you made. See, I want to show you a thing. I don't see any difference between adolescents of any generation. The fact being that most parents of any generation can tell you that they could not handle their children when they got in the adolescence. And rebellion seemed to be a part of that activity.
And I would agree to that.
Okay. But now, the nature of the rebellion and the degree of the rebellion depended on the peer group around which that child was centered. If you had a highly rebellious peer group, then your child was going to be highly rebellious. Because at this point in time, his eyes were not fixed on you as the parent. His eyes were fixed on his peers. So it doesn't mean that you were a failure as the parent. It means that the child is going through a normal, natural process.
In which we would, I would agree. I don't
Therefore,
know
if you ask the child about it, he'll tell you, this is family. And this is the bonding that occurs during the adolescent period and generally carries on through to the rest of their lives. What do you think the Kiwanis Club is?
All right. The problem is this, as I see it. We now say, your theory, as you've articulated it this evening, is graffiti is an indication that we are going to have a gang problem. All right. And
the nature
from
of the graffiti that we see.
Okay, the nature of the graffiti you see. And based upon that graffiti, one should be aware of the fact that gangs are going to be developed, not by what we would think happened years ago,
Right.
but by some third party orchestrating the formation of these gangs.
Right.
All right. This is the theory that you've given us this evening. And based upon that, we should be really concerned about the graffiti you found, you know, and at least not that you found in this instance in Bethlehem, but some indication that there was some graffiti found in some areas of Bethlehem, and that would be an indication that the next step will be the gangs, and that you felt...
The next step will be murder.
Okay. That somebody's going to get murdered.
And it's going to be shocking. And generally, it'll be a little old lady. Or somebody that you wouldn't expect anything of, something that would be capturing, that would get the news, or the nice kid, the kid who is the exceller in sport or in academia. But it's never just the kid out there selling
But then you
drugs.
say that from that point, we get to the next point, that the reason why other children who may not have been in gangs now join the gangs is because of this fear?
The one thing is, once they understand it, see, children can be very easily panicked. Then what will come down is, as people begin to blow it up, because the first thing that's going to happen is that the gangs did that, or they're going to imply it. And then when you speak of gangs, immediately the adolescent know you're talking about him. Then they will begin to do whatever they need to do to strengthen their peer group. Now, their peer group already exists. Okay? Now, another thing we used to say in Los Angeles, if your parents make $30,000 or more, you're in a club. If your parents make under 18, you're in a gang. But if you find a child that is in neither one, then he's in psychiatry. Do you understand my point?
I understand.
Now, my point being, therefore, the kids are already grouped and peer grouped. All now that is lacking is adult interference to change the concepts and the consciousness of that child. So if you get the wrong adults in that peer group, then that peer group can be turned either to be people that help little ladies across the street, that sing in the choir and that do camping, or they can be the kids who are trying to find guns, who are trying to kill, who are trying to do this, that, and the other. It depends on the outside influence. Okay? And my point is, at this point, it does not appear yet that that adult's negative outside influence has yet come to town. And I'm saying you better get your kid first before they do. And if you do get your children first in terms of putting that ring around them, then the others can't get in. But if you want to put the ring around them, you don't say you bind this child to his family, because that's not going to happen. You have to strengthen the peer group and circle it so that nobody gets in. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Well, isn't that a standard principle in raising children? I hear many times in the old days, you heard that phrase before, that if your child was in trouble and your neighbor saw your child in trouble, your neighbor would come to the rescue or spank the child. But today we don't do that. So isn't that the same philosophy?
You get sued if you did it.
Right.
Okay, but the other important point would be this, that when the child got to be a teenager, that the neighbor couldn't spank that teenager, and very often couldn't even talk to that teenager. But one of the things they could do is observe and report to the parent what they saw. The other thing that the neighbor would do, while they would not jump on that teenager, when they saw a stranger begin to deal with that teenager and interfere, then the neighbor would step forward and jump the stranger. In other words, as we see adults begin to have too close a relationship with children, young adolescents. And in other words, these are not adults who are trained and who really want to work with adolescents because they're working there. These are adults who tend to have an adolescent frame of mind. So these are the ones who bring the drugs to the adolescents or bring the kinds of bad things to the adolescent. When we were looking at some problems with venereal disease on the reservation back in the 50s, and we had a breakout of that problem in one of the boarding schools on the reservation, we had to call CDC in to help us get a handle on that. And one of the things they did was they did cluster examination, where they brought the adolescent in and just asked questions about who do you associate with and who are your friends, and they would keep asking and they'd keep asking. And what they let us know was we keep asking until we find the adult. And the reason being that it isn't sexual promiscuity, because adolescents will act out and do that. There's not supposed to be venereal disease within that population, so no matter how much promiscuity is in the population, they won't get the disease. But an adult has to come and introduce the disease to the population, then it spreads within the population. So what we're trying to find out, as they told us, we're trying to find the adult. And if we can find the adult, then we jump the adults, and that will stop the venereal disease within the population.
Okay, but here we can't identify the adult, so you're telling us in the instance of gang violence, you have to fortify the peer group itself, isn't that?
You do, and you have to protect the peer group by watching the adults who come to it. Now, what does that mean? You have to start right off the bat. For instance, you got some information that the Blackstone Rangers are supposed to be coming into Bethlehem and Allentown to sell drugs. Well, that's what they say to everything east of the Mississippi River. And on the west of the Mississippi River, it's supposed to be the Crips and the Bloods from Los Angeles. And then if you go to St. Louis, you find it all there. Okay, and when you look at that, we already disproved the fact that there's even such a thing as Crip and Blood. We can go into what that means. If you get into the graffiti, into the Druidism, you'll understand what really it means. So that when you look at it all, it's all gas. In other
Dr.
words,
Smith, it's been a very, very provocative discussion this evening. Very interesting. We're happy that you could be with us this evening, and maybe we can continue with another discussion another time on this very interesting subject and very interesting ideas that you have about gang violence.
Very interesting. Thank you for being on our show.
good.
Good evening.